Yeah. Sorry, guys, that we had missed last week, but we're back, and we're pretty much intending on doing this every week unless something comes up, and then we will let you guys know when the next one would be after. So we ended last time right around the end of chapter 20 of Jubilees. And of course, there's 50 chapters of Jubilees. So we foresee that this whole series might take a while, but we're really trying to go in depth in working through the book of Jubilees together to see if there's any insights or new revelations that can be gleaned, especially in connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls or related literature, apocryphal literature. And so we're going to continue with that. Just load this one page.
Can you give us an idea where we're at now?
Yeah, so basically we're pretty much right near the end of Abraham's life. In fact, where we're starting off is the final year of Abraham's life. And so up to this time, we've gone through and discussed the lives of the various patriarchs, and we've been focusing on Abraham the last couple times. And so we're going to wrap up Abraham's story today, and then we're going to start diving into Jacob's story, because Isaac's story kind of gets skipped over. It's more, we have Abraham's story and Jacob's story, and Isaac is kind of like the middle ground where Isaac's story is covered in Abraham's story and Jacob's, but Isaac doesn't really have his own story. And there's not absolute proof, but as I mentioned in the other teaching we did, I think it was last week, Isaac doesn't seem to have ever written a book from his own perspective. Like there's a book of Abraham, which was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that Jubilees tells us the book of Abraham existed. So Dead Sea Scrolls corroborates what Jubilees says. But then Jubilees also tells us about a book of Jacob, but it doesn't tell us about a book of Isaac. So Isaac's story is just kind of skipped over pretty much, but the relevant information about Isaac is covered in Abraham's story and Jacob's story. So that's kind of where we are right at the end of Abraham's story and about to begin Jacob's story. So with that, I'll get started. And so as Genesis tells us, Abraham lived to 175 years old. And one thing we talked about the other time was how Abraham, after Sarah died, he married again one of his servants named Keturah, and he had a family with her, many kids, and so it's just kind of crazy to think about that. So he pretty much lived a full life, and just like Job, because in the book of Job, Job lost his kids, and then he had a whole new family and saw them to old age and saw his grandkids from that even new family. So Abraham lived a full life of 175 years, pretty impressive for his time period. Now, this, I've mentioned this before as well, Jubilees in general, overall, has a more accurate, more reliable chronology, I believe, versus Genesis. I think the manuscripts, the copies that we have of the book of Genesis are less reliable because the scribes were more bold to alter Genesis. The reason they were more bold to do it is because Genesis was such a major text that was being used by everybody. So if it's being used by a lot of people and you want people to accept something, it makes sense to make some big changes if you want the group to believe your interpretation of history or theology and whatnot. with something like Jubilees, there was very few people, relatively speaking, who accepted Jubilees as scripture. So there was less motivation to alter the text of Jubilees. The only errors we see in Jubilees, essentially, are scribal errors, scribal mistakes, where they make a incorrect mark. Like, for example, in English, the number 8 looks very similar to the number 3. So if you're reading a handwritten document, and if there's cursive and all kinds of things, very often letters and numbers could easily be confused. So that is what happened in some instances with the Book of Jubilees, where some numbers were written down incorrectly by some of the scribes. So the scribes who were copying it got confused. And other times, the scribes felt there was contradictions, so they tried to fix the contradictions. So sometimes you'll see the scribes are trying to do math to try to fix stuff. So that's kind of what's going on with the Book of Jubilees in the manuscripts we have, where some of the numbers don't add up. Some of the numbers contradict each other. But overall, there's a picture of the chronology so that you can easily tell which verses are in error and which are not. You can tell it's like imagine if you have a puzzle piece, a puzzle, let's say 1,000 pieces, and you're trying to put the pieces together in the puzzle piece. Well, if you have like 3/4 of the puzzle completed, you have a pretty good idea of what the overall picture is. So if someone then hands you fake puzzle pieces that don't fit the overall picture, you can tell right away, okay, that obviously does not fit. So that's what we have with Jubilees. There's the errors in Jubilees are very easy to identify. Okay, that was a scribal error, that type of thing. Whereas with Genesis and some of the other books of the Old Testament, those errors are not as clear because the scribes didn't just make mistakes. They did make many mistakes, but the scribes also made intentional changes based on their interpretation or understanding of history and of, as I said, of theology. So that's why I think Jubilees is so important for chronology purposes, because it resolves a lot of disputes and uncertainties about the scriptural chronology and history. So in this verse, like, I'm using R.H. Charles' version, and I like to use the one on Summa Scriptura website. I don't know if any of you guys have used it, but that is a pretty good website. It has some apocryphal text on it, and it says, like, R.H. Charles has like brackets added to mark the dates for, like, Jubilees tells us, like, this event happened in this Jubilee, in this week of that Jubilee, in the year of that week. It has that chronology using Jubilees. That's why it's called Book of Jubilees, because instead of saying the 2000th year after creation, it tells you what Jubilee it is and what week of that Jubilee and what year of that week. So in this case, we see the translator puts in brackets the dates to help people understand, oh, okay, this Jubilee means this date. It's like a conversion table, essentially. And so in this verse, chapter 21, verse 1, the conversion table essentially has in brackets 2057 AM. AM means the year of the world, which is basically the year since creation.
Like 4000 BC, 4004, according to.
That's according to Masoretic text reckoning.
Okay. Now, I was going to ask you about that anyway. Just how valid are those transformed dates? You consider them valid?
The Jubilees dates?
Yeah, that are in the margin.
Oh, well,
At least in
in
the
the,
Charles
in,
version.
in the English translation, those dates are supplied by the translator entirely.
Yeah.
It's not in the Ethiopian text. Most of those dates are correct, but there are a few errors that Charles has made, which scholars have actually noted that he has made a few mistakes in the numbering system. However, as I said, most of the numbering is accurate, but some of the manuscripts differ of the numbers. And like in this one, it says 2057 and in parentheses 2050 question mark. And the reason is because some verses seem to indicate 7 years difference, 7 years prior. So that's why R.H. Charles has the question mark, because it's not clear which date is intended. But when you do, I don't remember off the top of my head which date is correct, but when you do a thorough study of the chronology, you can easily discern which, when it was that Abraham died. And actually, I should be able to, let me see. I think it's the 2050 is the correct, and not 2057, but I would have to double check on that. So, anyways, we'll continue with that from that, and we'll move on. Okay, so we have something very interesting here. You know how the Torah has all kinds of laws about sacrifice and various rituals. Well, what's interesting is, according to Jubilees, a lot of these laws originated prior to Moses. As we've discussed in other videos, the holy days, the festival days, have originated with the various patriarchs. Like Shavuot originated with Noah, and the 7 days of unleavened bread originated with Abraham. The Feast of Tabernacles originated with Abraham. So there's all kinds of holy days that originated prior. So Jubilees is very good in kind of telling us the origin of the law. That's what the Jubilees is all about: origin of law, origin of covenant. Whereas Genesis is more focused on the actual history, Jubilees is focused on Genesis is focused on the history of the people of Israel, whereas Jubilees is focused on the history of the law of Israel. So it goes and approaches it more from a legal perspective, covenant, legal origination, things like that. Whereas Genesis is focusing on the people themselves and the relationships. So that is why certain things get skipped over, like the whole account of the giants and the sins of the watchers get skipped over because it's not really relevant to the history of the people of Israel. It is very much relevant to the legal understanding of righteousness and holiness, and that is why Jubilees really focuses on it so much. And it also focuses on the books of Scripture, because Genesis, again, is just talking strictly about the history of the people, so it skips over the books, the holy texts. Like, it doesn't tell us, Genesis doesn't tell us about the Genesis Apocryphon, the Book of Enoch, or any of those books. It doesn't tell us those books existed, because it's not a document. Genesis is not a document intended for giving an overview of like that type of documentary type thing, and the legal nuance. It's more, as I said, more of the actual people's history. But Jubilees focuses on that legal perspective, so that's why we see the heavy discussion about the books of scripture that the various patriarchs wrote, such as Jubilees tells us that Enoch wrote a book, that Noah wrote a book, that Abraham and Jacob wrote a book, and that the various, I believe it also mentions, it might mention Levi, I can't remember if it mentioned, Jubilees mentions Levi or not, but at any rate, it mentions a lot of writings, so it's very clear that Jubilees has that focus, and the reason, as we learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Testament of Kohath, and Jubilees corroborates this, the scriptures was very much the prerogative of the priests, the priesthood. So the priests were actually given a law to preserve the scriptures and pass them on. So that is why Jubilees really focuses on that type of stuff. So with that said, what law is Jubilees here in chapter 21 speaking of? The origination of. And that law specifically is the one which says that you are to, in verse 10, it says, eat its meat on that day and on the second day, and let not the sun on the second day go down upon it till it is eaten, and let nothing be left over for the third day, for it is not acceptable, because it is not approved, and let it no longer be eaten. And all who eat thereof will bring sin upon themselves. For thus I have found it written in the books of my forefathers, and in the words of Enoch, and in the words of Noah. So here we see the origin. There's actually, this law is in the book of Leviticus, which says, the sacrifice is to be considered an abomination on the third day, and nothing is to be eaten on the third day after the sacrifice. So this law from Leviticus is very ancient, according to Jubilees. It does not originate with Moses. It does not originate with the Levitical priesthood. It originates far prior. This law originated with Enoch, it says, and with Noah. So, but however, the book of Enoch does not have this law. So that means we're missing some of the book, some of what Enoch said. Some of what Enoch said is gone. Evidence that there might have been other stuff Enoch wrote is, first of all, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we actually have in the Genesis Apocryphon. We have fragments of a book of Enoch that was given to Lamech, and it's a completely different book than the book of Enoch that we know. It does correspond with the final chapters of the book of Enoch, and it tells the story of Lamech and his son Noah. And so that's one key evidence that there's other stuff that Enoch wrote that's not in the book of Enoch. We also see evidence in the book of Giants that Enoch wrote other stuff, because in the fragments of the book of Giants, we see fragments of another writing attributed to Enoch. And then finally, there's another document preserved by Christians from Slavonic regions, and that is referred to by scholars as Second Enoch, also known as the Secrets of Enoch. This document, in many ways, is corrupt and unreliable when compared to First Enoch, or the Book of Enoch that everyone knows. But I think it is legit in its original, and there are, in Second Enoch, there are passages which talk about sacrifices. So it's very plausible that the original version of Second Enoch had information basically in line with what Jubilees is saying Enoch wrote. So there is definitely indication and evidence that Enoch did write other stuff. And so if Jubilees says something was written by Enoch and it's not in our copies of Enoch, there's reason to believe that what Jubilee says is true, and that there was a writing in ancient times that had those words of Enoch in an actual document. And in support of that as well is the fact that the copies of the Book of Enoch themselves in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they are in Aramaic, and in many instances, when you compare with the Ethiopian text that we have, the Aramaic text is very different. Typically, it's longer. It has extra words not found in our copies, especially the calendar section. You know, we're so focused on the calendar, and we're trying to follow the Enoch calendar. But many people have an erroneous system of the Enoch calendar because they assume that everything Enoch wanted us to know about the calendar is in the book of Enoch. But it's simply not true, because the original book of Enoch, yes, had the full explanation of the calendar. But over time, the scribes condensed that material significantly, as we have found proven in the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the longer version of Enoch found in fragments. And in that longer version had a much longer copy of the calendar section. So we got to be careful when we try to be too dogmatic about our interpretation of the Enoch calendar. If we try to justify it with, well, that's what Enoch says, so it has to be, because if it wasn't the case, then Enoch would have told us. Like, for example, the intercalation of 7 days. Many of us, I believe correctly, believe that a 7-day week is to be added every few years, every several years. This is not explicitly mentioned by Enoch in our copies. So some people would argue, because Enoch never told us that in our copies, that means it can't be true. But as the Dead Sea Scrolls proves, just because it's not in our copies doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't in the original text of the book of Enoch. So now we can't just say if it has to be in the book of Enoch in our copies. Now we have to see, okay, let's try to understand what Enoch is saying and use logic to what he's saying. If we apply logic to what he says, we can fill in the holes of Scripture. There are holes in the book of Enoch. So by reading what our copies of Enoch say, we can see, okay, here's the principle that Enoch is telling us. Let's take this principle and apply it and try to fill in the holes, the gaps that the scribes left us in the book of Enoch. So if we do that, I think we can have a high degree of confidence of a proper calendar system. So that is one of the amazing things in this chapter of the origin of law, specifically connecting it, the law of Leviticus, to Enochian times. But then it goes even farther and is a very powerful section. And I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to specify the importance and significance of this. So it says, chapter 21, verses 11 to 18. And on all thy oblations thou shalt strew salt, and let not the salt of the covenant be lacking in all thy oblations before the Lord. And as regards the wood of the sacrifices, beware lest thou bring wood for the altar in addition to these: cypress, bay, almond, fir, pine, cedar, savin, fig, olive, myrrh, laurel, and aspalathus. And of these kinds of wood lay upon the altar under the sacrifice such as have been tested as to their appearance. And do not lay any split or dark wood, but hard and clean, without fault, a sound and new growth. And do not lay old wood, for its fragrance is gone, because there is no longer fragrance in it as before. Besides these kinds of wood, there is none other that thou shalt place, for the fragrance is dispersed, and the smell of its fragrance goes not up to heaven. Observe this commandment and do it, my son, that thou shalt be upright in all thy deeds. And at all times be clean in thy body, and wash thyself with water before thou approachest to offer on the altar. And wash thy hands and thy feet before thou drawest near to the altar. And when thou art done sacrificing, wash again thy hands and thy feet. And let no blood appear upon you nor upon your clothes. Be on thy guard, my son, against blood. Be on thy guard exceedingly. Cover it with dust. And do not eat any blood, for it is the soul. Eat no blood whatever. So that's from Jubilees. And there's two documents I'm going to read in connection with what I just read from Jubilees. So the first is the Testament of Levi from the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs in the Greek manuscripts. And so, let's see here. Okay. So it says in chapter 9 of the Testament of Levi, and after 2 days, I'm gonna skip this for a second. Okay. Okay, verse 6 of chapter 9 of Testament of Levi. And Isaac called me continually to put me in remembrance of the law of the Lord, even as the angel of the Lord showed unto me. And he taught me the law of the priesthood, of sacrifices, whole burnt offerings, first fruits, freewill offerings, peace offerings. And each day he was instructing me and was busied on my behalf before the Lord, and said to me, beware of the spirit of fornication, for this shall continue, and shall by thy seed pollute the holy place. Take therefore to thyself a wife without blemish or pollution, while yet thou art young, and not of the race of strange nations. And before entering into thy holy place, bathe. And when thou offerest the sacrifice, wash. And again, when thou finish the sacrifice, wash. Of 12 trees having leaves, offer to the Lord, as Abraham taught me also. And of every clean beast and bird, offer a sacrifice to the Lord. And of all thy first fruits and of wine, offer the first as a sacrifice to the Lord God. And every sacrifice thou shalt salt with salt. Okay, so we stop there. So there's some amazing agreements between these two. It can't be coincidence. That means either the Testament of Levi got its information from Jubilees, or Jubilees got it from Testament of Levi, or they both got it from a common source. So some of the similarities are that the 12 trees, both mentioned only 12 trees can be used, and then both emphasize that you have to wash after everything. The priest has to wash after doing every step. And then also, it specifically states that in Jubilees, Abraham is teaching this to Isaac. It says in chapter 21, verse 1, it says, Abraham called Isaac his son and commanded him. And so what I read from Jubilees, starting in verse 11, about the priestly stuff, the salt and the trees and the washing, all that is specifically from Abraham commanding to Isaac. And the Testament of Levi said, as these laws were as Abraham taught me also. And both Jubilees and the Testament of Levi emphasize that you are to salt the sacrifices. So some striking correspondences there. And not only this, as I said, there's two documents. The other document is called Aramaic Levi document. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very long, but it actually is an Aramaic version of the Testament of Levi, but a much older, more archaic, more authoritative version. Basically, the evidence indicates to us that the Testament of Levi was originally written in Hebrew/Aramaic, and that the scribes later made a much shorter version, and it was probably created by the Christian scribes. So Christians probably took the text of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs and shortened it significantly and condensed it to the basic gist of the story, because it was a very long document, longer than the book of Genesis and Exodus. I think it's longer than both of them combined. That's how long it was. the original text of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. So scribes were not as willing to copy a huge text like that if no one was going to use it, or very few people were going to use it. So because they didn't want the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs to disappear entirely, the scribes decided, okay, you know what? We're going to create a summary of this, because if this text becomes lost, we want people to at least know the basic gist of the story and the information. So they took the full major long stuff and they shortened it to give us the Reader's Digest version of the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. And we are very fortunate for that, because without it, we would be at a loss for a lot of information. Now, because they did that, they sometimes added their interpretation, especially in passages of messianic prophecy. So sometimes there are certain prophecies that seem a little bit too Christian to be authentic. Those prophecies are probably based on real prophecies in the original Hebrew Jewish text, but the prophecies were probably less ambiguous and not as clearly messianic and not as clearly Christian. But in later times, the scribes interpreted those prophecies as Christian, pointing to Yeshua, and so they changed the text to make it more explicitly Christian. And that was an interpretation. They didn't just add a random prophecy, but they took the prophecy that was already there and added their spin on it, their understanding. Sometimes I think they were pretty faithful to the prophecy, but other times they may have twisted it a little bit unintentionally. So that's kind of the extent of what happened with the Testaments. So we are fortunate to have found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as Cairo Geniza, fragments of the original version of the Testament of Levi, as well as fragments of the original version of the Testament of Naphtali. So in this fuller version of the Testament of Levi, this same passage that Jubilees talks about is found in great detail. So I'm going to read some of that stuff. I have a PDF file, so I'm just going to pull it up. Okay. It's extremely lengthy, so I'm going to skip. The parts I'm going to skip are the sacrifices, because it gives like extremely detailed stuff about the sacrifices. Like you know, so how Jubilee said, it said, let's see, where was it? No, it was the Testament of Levi which said it, and it says in the Testament of Levi, he taught me the law of the priesthood, of sacrifices, whole burnt offerings, first fruits, free will offerings, peace offerings. So he basically taught him how to do the sacrifices, and that's what we see. We see in this longer version of the Testament of Levi a full, in-depth command of how to do the sacrifices. And the implications of this are very important, because a lot of people argue that the Levitical priesthood did not exist before the golden calf incident. That's what some people like Nolan, who teach that Melchizedek priesthood thing, that's what some of these people are teaching, that these laws did not originate, the Levitical priesthood did not originate until after Moses. But the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jubilees, and the Testaments of the Patriarchs paint a very different picture. They teach that no, the Levitical priesthood was in existence and was very much active and was limited, restricted only to the line of Levi. So originally, Abraham was a priest. Isaac was a priest. And then Isaac taught Levi the laws of the priesthood, of how to be a priest. And at that point, when Levi was chosen, he was made high priest, and the Levitical priesthood was created with Levi, according to these documents, Jubilees, and the Testaments of the Patriarchs. So, hold on one sec, okay? All right. So, Levitical priesthood originated, as I said, with Levi himself, and Levi actually was the first high priest of the Levitical priesthood, and then his son Kohath was the next high priest, and then his son Amram was the next high priest, and finally Aaron was. So Aaron was not the first Levitical high priest. So that refutes a lot of false doctrines that people are teaching against the law. A lot of people have false teachings against the law of Moses, and some people teach that the animal sacrifices, they teach some false things about the animal sacrifices, in my view. They say that the animal sacrifices, none of those things were commanded until after the golden calf incident. But what we see in Jubilees and the Testaments of the patriarchs is that some of the sacrifices were commanded, or at least they were allowed. The way the Testament of Levi in the longer version reads, it doesn't say you must you must do these sacrifices. Instead, the way it presents it is, when you do these sacrifices, do it this way. So it doesn't tell us when the sacrifices are to be done, but it just tells us this is how these sacrifices are to be done. And so it's very clear once we see these other writings that you have to make a choice. Do you go with these writings, or do you go with the false narrative that is being taught about against the law and against the Levitical priesthood? Because there is evidence, I'm very much convinced of this, that the Levitical priesthood is not obsolete. It is not done away with. Some people might appeal to Hebrews to argue that it's gone. But we have the testimony of Enoch. Enoch tells us that the temple, there's going to be a third temple, and it is going to be a temple of Elohim, a righteous temple, that Enoch and Elijah are going to endorse. And this is going to be, we are told in the book of Enoch, this will happen before the judgment takes place. This is in chapter 90 of the book of Enoch, I believe, and in the dream vision. So we also have the book of Jeremiah, which tells us that as long as there are sun and moon, the Levitical priesthood will not be annulled. The covenant with Levi will remain forever, as long as the sun and the moon and the heavens are there. And that's interesting, because that's the same type of language the Messiah uses when he speaks of the law not being abolished. He has not come to abolish the law. As long as the heavens are here, the law shall not be abolished. It says in the Gospel of Matthew. So when we read overall the book of Jubilees, we see a very different story where the Levitical priesthood is very much in full force with Levi himself. So that, to me, is very powerful, and you can learn a lot of truth from this understanding and revelation of the Levitical priesthood. So with that said, I'm going to read parts of this Testament of Levi in the longer version for the sacrifice stuff. Not the sacrifice, but for the priest stuff. Okay. And we went from Bethel, and we camped at the fortress of Abraham our father with Isaac our father. And Isaac our father saw all of us, and he blessed us, and he rejoiced. And when he knew that I was a priest of God Most High, Lord of heaven, he began to instruct me and teach me the law of the priesthood. And he said to me, Levi, guard yourself, my son, from all impurity and from all sin. Your law is greater than all flesh. And now, my son, I will show you the true law, and I will not conceal any matter from you to teach you the law of the priesthood. First, guard yourself, my son, from all wantonness and impurity, and from all sexual immorality. And as for you, take for yourself a wife from my clan, and do not desecrate your seed with prostitutes. Behold, you are a holy seed, and your seed is holy, just like the holy place, since you are called a holy priest for all the seed of Abraham. You are near to God and near to all his holy ones. Now be worthy in your flesh from all impurity of every man. And when you stand to enter the house of God, bathe in water and then put on the priestly vestment. And when you are clothed, wash your hands and your feet once again before you approach the altar at all. And when you take to offer all that is proper to take to the altar, wash your hands and your feet once again and make the offering, splitting logs and examine them for worms, and then lift them up. For like so did I see Abraham, my father, taking pains. From all 12 kinds of wood, he said to me that it is proper to take of them to the altar, the scent of whose smoke rises sweetly. And these are their names: cedar, juniper, almond, fir, acacia, pine, cypress, fig, and oleaster, laurel, myrtle, and asphalethos. These are the ones that he said to me, it is fitting to lift up of them beneath the holocaust on the altar. And when you lift up any of these woods onto the altar, and the fire begins to kindle them, behold, then you shall begin to sprinkle the blood on the sides of the altar. And again wash your hands and your feet of the blood, and begin to lift up the salted limbs. And so it keeps going and gives details of the sacrifices. And then it says, and if everything that you do it in order, do it by measure and by weight. You shall not add anything that is not proper, and you shall not leave out of reckoning what is proper, of the wood proper for offering for all that ascends the altar. And then it gives how much wood for each animal that you sacrifice, how much is proper. So there's very clear and strict laws of the priesthood and animal sacrifices prior to the golden calf. So if the Testament of Levi and Jubilees are legit and authentic writings, according to them, the animal sacrifices have very necessary laws for holiness. If you are going to do an animal sacrifice to the Creator, you have to do it the proper way for it to be considered holy. And there is a strict way for it to be holy. That's what we see in these writings. So then it continues a little bit later and says, and every hour wash hands and feet when you go to the altar. And when you go out of the sanctuary, do not let any of the blood touch your robe. Do not lay hold of it on the same day. And wash hands and feet completely of all flesh. And let there not be seen on you any blood or any life, for the blood is life in the flesh. And if in the house you eat some meat for yourself, cover its blood with earth first, before you eat any of the meat, and do not any longer be eating in proximity to the blood. For thus did my father Abraham command me, because he found it so in the writing of the book of Noah concerning the blood. And now as to you, beloved child, I say, you are beloved to your father and a holy one of the Lord Most High, and you shall be beloved over all your brothers. By your seed shall one be blessed on the earth, and your seed shall be preserved for all the ages in the book of remembrance of life. And your name and the name of your seed shall not be erased for the ages. And now, child, Levi, bless
Are we hung up?
I think so.
Hey, I'm back.
Okay.
Where did my audio cut out?
About 2 minutes ago, you were quoting something about a child.
And a blessing.
Okay, let's see. Um, so where it said, uh, did you hear me mention the Book of Remembrance of Life?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just read that sentence again. By your seed shall one be blessed on the earth, and your seed shall be preserved for all the ages in the book of remembrance of life. And your name and the name of your seed shall not be erased for the ages. And now, child Levi, blessed shall your seed be on earth for the generations of the ages. So what I had said was, it mentions the book of remembrance of life, and that sounds like the book of life that you see in Revelation. And so we wonder when we see stuff like this in the New Testament, where did it come from? Well, this is evidence that like some of these concepts originated in Dead Sea Scrolls type of literature, because we find it here in the Testaments of the Testament of Levi here. And when it said, when Levi in this Testament of Levi said, thus did my father Abraham command me, because he found it so in the writing of the book of Noah concerning the blood. Well, Jubilees tells us in this same section, chapter 21, he had said, this is Abraham talking to Isaac. It's quoting Abraham as saying, for thus I have found it written in the books of my forefathers, and in the words of Enoch, and in the words of Noah. So Jubilees has Abraham telling his son Isaac that the laws of the priesthood he found written in the book of Enoch and in the book of Noah. And in the Testament of Levi, the longer version, it has us telling us that Abraham told Isaac that he found it in the writing of the book of Noah. So this is an amazing correspondence, and it can't be coincidence. Again, this is too striking a correspondence. So Jubilees, since it claims to take so much of its information from earlier documents, it makes more sense to believe that Jubilees got this information from the Testament of Levi, the original version, the longer version of the Testament of Levi. So this is a concept like, the law speaks of 2 or 3 witnesses. And here we're seeing the 2 witnesses, Jubilees and the Testament of Levi. They are confirming each other. And so we didn't know about this prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. But once the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we discovered that Jubilees has so many striking correspondences with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's unbelievable how many agreements there are. I've touched upon this before, but it also has some amazing agreements with the Testament of Amram. Amram was the father of Moses and Aaron. And there's some stuff in the Testament of Amram which is found nowhere else except in the book of Jubilees. And again, we've talked about how the Genesis Apocryphon, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, has agreements with the book of Jubilees, found nowhere else. No other document has this information, but Jubilees and Genesis Apocryphon have the same information. So in many ways, Jubilees is a key to restoring the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's a window into a lost world. Jubilees is a testimony to what was once in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a link, a gateway to the Dead Sea Scrolls in many ways. So I think to understand the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's absolutely essential to understand the Book of Jubilees, because Jubilees is like the foundation text of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or at least one of the main ones. In fact, Jubilees is quoted in the Essene writing known as Damascus Document. The Book of Jubilees is actually quoted in it. And it's the information in Jubilees is relied upon heavily in many other Dead Sea Scroll documents. So, or Jubilees relies on other documents. As I said, the relationship is one way or the other. And basically any documents that claim to be written by a patriarch are probably the source of Jubilees. Any writing in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is, claiming to be written by a patriarch, was probably the source of Jubilees rather than derived from Jubilees. So that's the extent of the testaments that I'll read for today. So that is, for me, that is one of the most amazing connections that I've found so far. So one thing to emphasize is the insistence that, hold on one sec. The insistence that the priests wash their bodies when they when they're dealing with blood, and that it's a very, very strong view against blood, where basically don't let blood appear on your clothes, don't let blood be around you, cover it with dust. We do see the command in the law to cover the blood with dust, but we don't really fully see in the scripture how bad blood is considered to be around you, and it's considered very polluting in these Dead Sea Scroll documents. So if we want to apply this to our lives, I think it's important that we treat animals with respect, and we don't like, for example, you don't want to bathe in the blood of animals. That's disgusting. That's an abomination. You don't want to profane and disrespect the blood of animals. So if you are to eat animals for food, treat the flesh with dignity. Bury the blood. Cover it. It's a way of honoring the life, because life is in the blood. And so we are not to have complete disregard for the value of the life that has been given for our benefit. So that it's very important, and I think I don't think that our culture really has that value of appreciation of the life of animals. There are people who do appreciate animals, and to some extent, very much so, to the point of believing we should not eat animals at all, which is a very noble enterprise to do. If you do not want to eat animals, that's a very noble thing, and I think you will be blessed and rewarded for that sacrifice. But too many people don't have that kindness towards animals. Too many people take animals for granted and abuse them. And the Yahad is talking about ameliorating the earth and redeeming creation. And how are we going to do that if we're abusing it and treating it horribly? So the best way, we're limited people. We don't have much power by ourselves. We do know, according to Yeshua, where two be gathered in his name, great things can be done. So we could accomplish great things if we come together in righteousness, but so few people are righteous that we many times don't have anyone to be our second person, and we might not be righteous enough ourselves. So the best thing we can do prior to finding a group of people that agree with us is simply taking responsibility for your own life, for your own actions, for your own behavior. So respecting creation in everything you do, not polluting the earth to the best of your ability. Unfortunately, the world we live in, we pretty much are going to pollute the earth inevitably because we're stuck in a system. But we can do our part to reduce the impact that we have, and we can try to respect life, whatever we do in our lives. So this emphasis is very important and Jubilees kind of indicates to us that it's not just about humans, but creation as well. The rest of creation is very much important.
Thank you. That was really good. I like that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Let me see. Okay, Jackson has left the building.
I'll be back in a minute. Give him a minute.
All right. Let's see what we've got here. Yeah, anyone have questions so far?
Do you have any links to any of those works that you were talking about during your teaching that are accessible for free or anything like you usually do, or no?
You talking about the Aramaic Levi document I was reading from?
Yeah, that'd be cool.
So there is this one website I use. It's not necessarily like the safest website to use, only in the sense that it's not recommended because some people could get it's potentially, it has a potential for some people to I don't know if viruses or something, but basically if you download files from an unknown source, there's a risk.
Right. What if you have pretty good antivirus software?
I mean, I haven't noticed any problems myself, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened to my to my computer. But I'll just post this one. This is this has the Testament of Levi that I was reading from.
Nice.
I'll put it in the chat box.
This is one of the greatest assets besides your teachings are your references. You know, you're just awesome. Thank you.
I believe in free sharing of the scriptures and in the resources because, like, I've talked about this before, but copyright, I believe, was invented. It had a good reason that they tried to invent it, but it's very much contrived, and I don't believe it's authentic. So I think it was good, well intended, because they were trying to help the authors, prevent them from losing money.
Well,
But in the process, they have taken away our rights, and they have extremely limited what we can do. Like, I don't know if you guys knew this, but for example, they actually copyrighted the Happy Birthday song. And until recently, like maybe a decade ago or something, or a couple decades ago, you were not allowed to publicly sing Happy Birthday unless you had permission from the copyright holders. You could sing it like in a private thing, but you couldn't do a performance.
Right. There's a lot of copyright on music. Being a former musician, you run into that all the time. You have to be very careful about how you do that. But that's, I get that, but this kind of literature should be out I agree with you, should be out there for people to be able to read,
Yeah, I think that there's a risk when you share some of this stuff. There's a risk, but it's a low risk because they typically are not. They're not looking to like get everyone in trouble. They're looking for the main people who they're much more likely to pursue legal action to people who are trying to make money off others. That's what you have to have big problems with.
Right.
If people are selling the scriptures, violating copyright, to do that, they're taking someone else's work and trying to make money off of it. They shouldn't be ripping people off for money anyway. I don't have a problem necessarily with people charging money for what they've written, even if it's like the scriptures, but within reason. and you don't want to say, oh, you don't have money, then I'm not going to give you a copy of the scriptures. That's not right. But
I think if it's a commentary or a translation, a fresh translation of something that's already in the public domain, yes, you have, that's your work, and you should be able to copyright your work. But if it's something that's been in the public domain, you shouldn't be able to lock it back up. And I think a lot of the stuff, like, probably has. I'm not sure about this document because that's pretty specific. But like you say, we're not trying to sell it. We're just trying to learn from it.
Well, so for example, there are certain places where it's forbidden to have Bibles in that area.
Oh yeah.
So do you break the law and give people Bibles even though it's illegal, or do you say, okay, well that's the law, and I don't think we are required to follow that law. When the law violates our rights, we do not have to submit to that law. So,
well, if I was going to do that, I would do it quietly, and I wouldn't.
Exactly.
Yes, I would give it as the need arose myself. Yes, I agree with you.
Jackson, you're back.
You're muted.
It was a Lasix break.
Oh, what's that?
That means you have to go pee.
Ah, yes, great, good to know. So did you do it according to the holiness that the Book of Deuteronomy commands? Did you take your little shovel thing?
Well, one of the questions now is that whether you do it standing up or sitting down. Not whether you go and bury it someplace. It's whether a man should stand up or sit down, and if a man sits down, is there something wrong with that?
Yes, and if you should leave the toilet seat up or not. That is another
especially when there's a woman in the house.
Yes.
You don't leave that toilet seat up, or you're in trouble.
Hey, dude, you just don't understand. If you don't know it's up and you go to sit down and you end up in the toilet in the middle of the night, oh, that's not good.
No. All right, so let's see here. Going back to Jubilees. I'm trying to see where we can stop here.
What did we stop on so I can make a note, please? Thank you.
So I'm going to go. We are pretty much at the end of chapter 21, and I'm going to quickly go through chapter 22 because that ends with Abraham's. That ends with the death of Abraham, and I kind of want to finish Abraham's story so we can move on to the Jacob story next time. So I'm going to quickly go to that. So. Okay. It says in chapter 22, verse 1, that in the second year, that is the year in which Abraham died, that came to pass in that year, the year in which Abraham died, that Isaac and Ishmael came from the well of the oath to celebrate the Feast of Weeks. That is the feast of the first fruits of the harvest to Abraham. They came to Abraham, their father, and Abraham rejoiced because his two sons had come. For Isaac had many possessions. I'm gonna skip that because I don't need to read everything. I'm just trying to give the overview here. So what's interesting about that is it tells us that they kept the Shavuot, and not just Isaac, but Ishmael too. Ishmael actually kept the holy days and he was keeping the law. He was commanded by Abraham to do that, and Ishmael obeyed because he was still part of the family of Abraham. But after a few generations, Ishmael's descendants stopped keeping it because they were no longer part of Abraham's family anymore. But we see that this is just a very ancient thing. And we see the Shavuot actually is a word in Hebrew that means weeks, but also oaths. So it's the well of the oath to celebrate the Feast of Oaths, or Feast of Weeks. And
Okay, can you elaborate on that just a tiny bit about the oaths that were involved?
So Shavuot originated with Noah, and it was made by a covenant and an oath by Elohim to not flood the earth again. So it's like a double meaning. It has the meaning of the oath and a meaning of weeks. Then it's like a play on words here, because they came to the well of the oath to celebrate the Feast of Oaths, or the Feast of Weeks. I'm going to double check that right now just to make sure, but
That's right.
1 second. Yes, so beer, they call it called Beer Sheba, or Beer Shiva. Okay, so Beer Sheba, the Sheba part, is spelled with a shin bet ayin. Okay, shin bet ayin. And Shavuot is spelled shin bet wa ayin wa tav. And that's a plural. The wa tav at the end is a plural. But it's the same root word, Shiba, or however you want to pronounce it, Shibaot. So it means oath, but it can also mean week, depending on context. So it's this double meaning that we see in Jubilees. At any rate, it is further evidence of the Feast of Shavuot being observed prior to Moses. So it does not originate with the law of Moses, as many people think. That's significant.
It is, yes, because
if people argue that the law of Moses was done away with, well, that's not part of the law. Just like if people say the law was done away with, they still believe that murder is wrong, right? They still believe adultery is wrong. They still believe stealing is wrong. They say the laws that were unique to the law of Moses, those are done away with. But if those laws preceded the law of Moses, then how can it be that the law being done away with suddenly makes those laws not valid? Because they didn't originate from the law of Moses. So if the law of Moses was done away with, that doesn't mean anything about all these pre-Moses laws. So that's important information to realize, that the argument that people make against the law doesn't have a lot of compelling force once we realize that most of the law originated prior to Moses.
Also, in Qumran, Shavuot was their primary festival, their most important one. So to know that goes back to Noach is awesome.
Yeah, they entered the covenant, like when people became Essenes, they had them become full members on Shavuot. That was their day of becoming a full member of their community, because on that day they renewed the covenant that was made with Noah, and that was considered the most important covenant of all, the covenant of blood, not to eat blood and to respect the blood and to keep the holy days. It was very much the foundational festival, as you pointed out.
Do you have any more details on that particular festival other than that?
Just stuff found in Jubilees, and there's some stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but nothing too much.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay. Most of it's.
We're going to work on that at Shavuot. That's
most of the extra stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls is sacrificial stuff that we can't do anyway. So, like animal sacrifices and whatnot. So now we see Abraham gives Jacob a blessing, and then for some reason he says, exercise authority over all the seed of Seth. I don't know why that is used. That could be a mistranslation, because Seth, it doesn't make sense. Seth is from, Adam's son Seth. Why would he say Seth? The word Seth in Hebrew actually has other meaning. Like the names in Hebrew, names have additional meaning. And so the name Seth here, I think, is a mistranslation. It's probably something deeper. Not the seed of Seth, the seed of establishment or something. I'd have to do a translation to really see. But yeah. And that's in verse 12, which speaks of the seed of Seth. And he says in verse 13, may the Most High God give thee all the blessings wherewith he has blessed me and wherewith he blessed Noah and Adam. May they rest on the sacred head of thy seed, generation to generation forever. So the blessing for Noah and Adam was very specific, and it indicates to us that Adam was not this horrible person. He sinned, but he was given an opportunity to redeem himself through repentance, and he received blessings for that. Okay, so now we see verse 16. Do thou, my son Jacob, remember my words, and observe the commandments of Abraham thy father. Separate thyself from the nations, and eat not with them, and do not according to their works, and become not their associate, for their works are unclean, and all their ways are a pollution and an abomination and uncleanness. So important there, it says, separate thyself from the nations, and eat not with them, and become not their associate, because their works are unclean, their ways are a pollution and an abomination of uncleanness. So what does this mean? Well, the Nazarene Acts actually says something very similar. It says if you're baptized, you are not supposed to eat with someone who is unbaptized. And we see the New Testament speak of some of the Jews not eating with Gentiles, and then Peter said it is permitted to eat with Gentiles who are of righteousness. And but this is very much so. Where did these ideas come from? It's very clear they originated from Jubilees, which demonstrates that we're not supposed to be eating, if we are of the covenant, we're not supposed to be eating with those who are not of covenant. If you're not in covenant, then it's okay to eat with people not in covenant, because you don't have to be holy in that same way. But when you're part of the covenant people, you have to be holy. So, for example, if you're a baby or if you're a young child, let's say you are a child to Gentiles. Well, you can eat with your parents because you are not sanctified, and it is okay. It's not a fair, and it's not a fair burden to place on children who are not part of covenant, that they can't eat with their family or friends. It's fair when they've grown up in the covenant and they know from birth that they're not allowed, or if they have joined the covenant as an adult. Once they decide to become holy, they are to separate themselves from those who are not holy. And this is an extra burden, extra requirement on those who want to be part of the covenant. It's not a requirement for those outside of the covenant. And this is something I've struggled with, because I have decided to not yet join the covenant, because I want to be very sure, and I want to purify myself There was a time years ago where I wasn't eating with anybody. I'm sure some of you guys remember that when I went to some of the events, the Yahad events. I was eating by myself and not really doing stuff with people. I've lightened up on that, and that's mainly because I've realized that I'm not holy and I'm not part of the covenant as of yet. So I believe eventually, if I'm going to join the covenant, I have to separate myself from those who are not. And that's very tough. It's very challenging because if you are to live this out, you have to be very holy, and not everybody is cut out for that. And it's a very challenging thing, but it's something that the scrolls are very emphatic on, holiness. And so if people are, I will say this, if people are not yet willing to take that leap of holiness, there are degrees of holiness. If you're not fully in covenant, or if you are in covenant but you're not strong enough to separate yourself, there are degrees of what you can do to purify yourself and keep yourself as holy as possible. And so just consider everything you're doing, and the Dead Sea Scrolls teaches the principle of cleanness and holiness. So if you aren't fully willing to follow everything as of yet, you could still implement a lot of the principles in your life of being clean, in your, healthy, and trying to avoid sinful stuff and avoiding activities which have a lot of uncleanness. Like, don't go to strip clubs, for example. Don't go to places that there's a lot of sin likely to be. You might not want to go to a beach because at beaches there's a lot of sin there sometimes. It all depends on how far you want to go in holiness. It's definitely worthwhile trying to consider all your actions, because we see the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the New Testament, the path to salvation is narrow. And as the New Testament says, broad is the way to destruction, few believe that find it. So there is a risk of being too overly strict, but there's also a risk of being too under cautious, not being cautious enough. So it's something we also struggle with, and we all have to figure out what's required of us and how holy do I need to be. And these are questions we're forced to ask when we're studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see, okay, these people were holy. I want to emulate them. How holy do I need to be acceptable? And that's something that we all should really try to work on, I think. And okay, the final thing that I'm going to mention is when Jacob dies in this chapter. It's just amazing, because I'm absolutely certain, without a shadow of a doubt, this is the origin of what's in the New Testament. So it says in verse 22, it says, they shall descend into Sheol. And then it says, so it's talking about Sheol. Abraham's talking about Sheol, and then right after he's talking about Sheol, it says, he ceased commanding him and blessing him, and the two lay together on one bed, and Jacob slept in the bosom of Abraham, his father's father, and he kissed him 7 times, and his affection and his heart rejoiced over him. And he blessed him with all his heart, and said, the Most High God, the God of all and Creator of all, who brought me forth from Ur of the Chaldees, that he might give me this land to inherit it forever, and that I might establish a holy seed, blessed be the Most High forever. And he blessed Jacob, and said, my son, over whom with all my heart and my affection I rejoice, may thy grace and thy mercy be lifted up upon him and upon his seed always. Do not forsake him, nor set him at naught from henceforth unto the days of eternity. And may thine eyes be opened upon him and upon his seed, that thou mayest preserve him and bless him, and mayest sanctify him as a nation for thine inheritance. And bless him with all thy blessings from henceforth until all the days of eternity. And renew thy covenant and thy grace with him, and with his seed according to all thy good pleasure unto all the generations of the earth. It says, and he placed 2 fingers of Jacob on his eyes, and he blessed the God of gods, and he covered his own face, and stretched out his feet, and slept the sleep of eternity, and was gathered to his fathers. And notwithstanding all this, Jacob was lying in his bosom, and knew not that Abraham his father's father was dead. And Jacob awoke from his sleep, and behold, Abraham was cold as ice, and he said, Father, Father, but there was none that spake, and he knew that he was dead. So the New Testament speaks of the bosom of Abraham. Very strangely, it says that Lazarus went into the bosom of Abraham. And it's confusing. Why does it say this? There's no real rhyme or reason why. Well, now we know why. Jubilees tells us why. The bosom of Abraham represents the story of Jacob lying in Abraham's bosom. Abraham was dead. Jacob was in Abraham's bosom with Abraham dead. So Lazarus similarly went to Abraham's bosom. Abraham was dead, and Lazarus went to his bosom, and that represents peace, safety, comfort, and acceptance, and is specifically for the people of Israel. Jacob is Israel, right? Jacob was later renamed as Israel, and Jacob is the forefather progenitor of Israel, and he is the representative of Israel. So when Jacob was in Abraham's bosom, this was a sign that Israel is in Abraham's bosom, and Israel is if those of Israel who are righteous, they will go, just like Jacob, they will be in Abraham's bosom. So that is the amazing significance of what Jubilee says connected to the New Testament. I'm sure that that is what it means. There's no other explanation of this phrase, Abraham's bosom. And it's too much of a correspondence to be coincidence. They have to be connected because it's connecting the bosom of Abraham with death. You know, if someone mentions someone's bosom, you don't normally associate that with death. But yet we have Jubilees and the Gospel of Luke, both associating it with death. So that can't be coincidence. So yeah, that is pretty much where I want to end today. The one other thing I saw in verse 20, no, not 20, verse 21 that I said that was interesting. You know how Ham sinned against Noah, and then Noah curses Canaan? Well, it's kind of confusing, right? Why does that happen? Well, we know on the scrolls that happened because Noah had a dream and saw in advance that Canaan was going to sin because of Ham. Canaan was going to sin due to Ham's transgression. And this is confirmed in verse 21 of chapter 22 of Jubilees, because it says, "For owing to the transgression of Ham, Canaan erred." So that I thought was a very interesting verse, because it tells us because Ham transgressed, that's why Canaan erred. And so anyways, that's the place I want to end today with Abraham's death and specifically Abraham's bosom and the amazing connection that has with the New Testament. Does anybody have any questions of anything I said briefly? Anyone? If not, then we'll end it here.
I have a little comment.
Sure.
One of our people on in the Yahad think tank has written diaglot of Jubilees in Genesis. I've just wrote to him, and I'm hoping to get an e-copy so we can follow along also in Genesis as well. Shoot.
Who's this?
What?
Hold on a second, I'll tell you.
Put a link up if you have it, when you get it.
It's Russell Redden.
I'm not sure I'm familiar with him.
No.
All right.
It's a diaglot of...
It's not called a diaglot. It's called Genesis and Jubilees Compared.
Right.
It's got them side by side.
Sweet.
And it's for sale.
Ooh.
But yeah, well,
$500.
I'm asking him to see if he's got an e-copy. we can use, and he'll usually get back with me, but I thought I'd let you know. But you can find that on Amazon. If you put Jubilees and Genesis into the search engine, you'll get it.
Only thing I will say about that, that sounds like a good resource. The only downside is if he's using the Masoretic text as a comparison, that's an issue because Jubilees actually often agrees with Genesis according to the Septuagint and Genesis according to the Samaritan version. But that it sounds like a great resource, though. I would be interested.
Well, even if it wasn't that good translation-wise, at least it would give you comparison of one verse to verse insofar as you could.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Maybe share it in the group if he's okay with that.
Okay.
I have a question for you, Ounieu.
Yeah.
The ideas you were talking about holiness earlier, and eating with other people. How do you see the verses where it speaks about Paul? Basically getting on to Peter about not eating with Gentiles. How do you see those verses playing out in the thought pattern you were expressing?
Okay, so under the law, it was basically just Israel and Gentiles. That's it. Whereas after Yeshua came, it's not just that. It's not just Israel and the Gentiles. Now it's Israel, the church, and the Gentiles. And so from what I understand, Israel is still only to eat with Israel. The church is now only to eat with those in the church. So the problem was that some Israelites in the church, some Jews who were part of the new movement of Yeshua, they were baptized, and then they were not eating with other Gentiles who were also baptized into the church. And what we see specifically with the issue of Peter was apparently, if we are to trust what Paul says, he was eating with Gentiles who were part of the covenant. He was eating with them, except when these other people came. Then he's like, oh, these people are here. I don't want them to think that I'm sinning. So when the other Jews came, he changed his behavior to try to please them and make them think that he wasn't being bad. Then when they went away, he started eating with them again. So he was being a hypocrite in that instance. So if he wasn't being hypocritical, I don't think Paul would have been as harsh with him for how he was behaving. That's how I read it. And I think that I don't think that contradicts the teaching of Peter and the Jubilees about not eating with those who are not part of the covenant. Peter in the Nazarene Act says for the baptized not to eat with those who are unbaptized. And that's something we've talked about this in the Yahad group. I'm going to actually eventually be doing a study of the Nazarene Acts, or the recognitions and homilies of Clement. It's going to be of it. Do we follow it? Do we follow parts of it? Was Peter right? Was he wrong? My take on it was Peter is correct, but that Peter was then being a hypocrite and not eating with some people who were baptized into the faith. So hopefully that answers the question. We'll probably end it here because we could, if there's more questions, we probably could keep going, but I know it's getting late, and Jackson likes to keep it shorter. So
I know. Hey, Ounieu, do you mind if I message you on Facebook about a couple of questions?
Not at all. Yeah, if anyone wants to message me, just message me, and stay tuned. Next week we'll do Jubilees as well.
Woohoo! Thank you.
Peace,
Thank you
brothers
all.
and sisters. Thanks for coming. Shalom.
It was great. Thank you all for coming. Let other people know, by the way, if you can, that they'll be interested in this. I know there's a limited interest in kind of a niche market for such things.
Is it okay to share it outside of Yahad?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're going to go up on podcasts and on YouTube. But the best thing you can do is offer other people as a free gift, like maybe a diamond ring or something.
No, I just meant to like my friends. I have a lot of friends, but not all of them are Yahadis.
I thought I was your only friend.
Oh, well, you're my best friend.
All right. See you all next time. Love you.
Hello.